techies, welcome to Tech City. Today we're learning about async await in JavaScript. So the first thing you want to know is how promises work in JavaScript. If you haven't watched my video on promises yet, I highly recommend that you watch that before continuing with this one. In the previous video, we talked about how showGreeting, a synchronous operation, was trying to use the value of an async operation where that value hadn't arrived yet, and that resulted in name being undefined. And so we talked about how instead of doing what we did earlier, we could use a promise so that the result of the async operation can be handled inside of the .then block. And by doing so, name wouldn't be undefined anymore. In this example, we're assuming that getName from DB is a promise that's already been created. We haven't covered how to create promises, and that's fine because a lot of times we'll use promises created by other people more than we'll make them. Now let's compare our incorrect code with our correct code that uses promises. And by the way, by incorrect, I mean it's not returning what we want, but the syntax is totally fine. Which syntax do you feel is easier to read? It's easier on the eyes, it's just easier to understand. You're probably thinking that the incorrect code actually looks a little better, like it's just easier to read. And so is there a way that we can make our promises easier to read? Yes, there is, and that's called async await. Async await is syntactic sugar for promises, which means that it makes promises just look easier to read or easier to use. This is our previous code with the promise refactored to use async await instead. The first thing you notice is the await keyword. It's waiting on the result of the promise getName from DB before it can save it in the name variable. This essentially replaces the .then of regular promises. The second thing is the async keyword. It needs to be there for the await to work. So it needs to be in front of whatever function is implementing the await keyword. Now notice how our async await code does the same thing that the regular promise syntax does, but it just looks easier to read. And also notice how it's very similar to that incorrect code that we talked about earlier. So one thing to note about async await is that it is blocking. It is a blocking operation. This means that any code that follows it will need to wait on the result of that promise. So showGreetingName, other function 1, other function 2, they're not going to run until the promise result has actually arrived. So you're probably wondering, is there any use to the old syntax then? I would say there is. It makes sense to use the regular promise syntax when you don't have a lot going on inside of your .then block. And it makes sense to use async await when that .then block would be really long, and you might as well just convert it to an async await so that it's clear that you're awaiting the result of the promise before doing all these other functions following it. And it also makes sense to use async await when you're awaiting multiple promises. You're waiting for multiple results from different promises, and it just keeps your code a little cleaner. Thanks so much for watching. If this was helpful, please share and follow me at Brina's Code. Bye!